Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, I'd like to thank you for joining us today for our webinar with the Union of Concerned Scientists, A Dwindling Role for Coal in the Southeast. My name is Amelia Shenstone, and I'm the Campaigns Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. For those of you not familiar with SACE, we are a nonprofit organization that promotes responsible energy choices that work to address the impacts of global climate change and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We are a membership organization, and we would like to acknowledge our members on this call and encourage those of you who are not members to please join us today. For ways in which you can become a member and get involved, please visit our website, www.cleanenergy.org. Now I'd like to take a moment to review the basic functions of the WebEx control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. To ensure sound quality, all attendee lines will be muted throughout this presentation. Go ahead and find the 3 buttons along the top of your control panel. If you're having trouble hearing or seeing the slides, click the blue chat button and type in your problem so that our administrator, Kyle, can help you troubleshoot. We have saved time at the end of this presentation to answer questions about today's topic. To ask a question, click the question mark button along the top of your screen. Make sure all panelists is showing up in the drop-down menu. Then type your question into the questions text box. We will do our best to answer questions in the order we receive them. Today we'll be hearing from Jeremy Richardson, one of the UCS analysts who wrote the report, with an overview of the project, followed by my colleague Simon Mahan, who will focus on wind energy opportunities. I will review state-by-state findings in the Southeast, and then J.C. Kibbe with UCS will present some community snapshots of coal transitions. From there, we will proceed to Q&A. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Jeremy Richardson, Senior Energy Analyst with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Jeremy?
Hi, everybody. As Amelia said, my name is Jeremy Richardson. I'm a Senior Energy Analyst at the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'm based here in our Washington, D.C. office. This was a team effort at UCS, and so I'm just going to be the voice for some of the work that we did on this particular project. As Amelia mentioned, the name of the report is A Dwindling Role for Coal, and that is tracking the electricity sector transition and what it means for the nation. So we actually did a national analysis for this project, and it wasn't just focused on the Southeast, but there were some significant and interesting findings for the Southeast, as I'll show you in a second. So first, I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of what we did and what the project was about. You can think of it in 3 buckets of work. So the first bucket was looking back at what has happened to the coal fleet between 2008 and 2016. So we made a list of the coal generating units that were operating in 2008 and looked at how many had either retired, gone offline, or converted to other fuels, most of those to natural gas. The second bucket was looking forward at what might happen into the future. And so here we actually constructed a list of coal generating units that have already been slated for retirement or conversion to other fuels, again, mostly natural gas. And we also repeated our calculation of an economic stress test that we did for each of the coal units. And this is based on a previous report that we did back in 2011 and updated in 2013 called Ripe for Retirement. So if you Google UCS and Ripe for Retirement, you'll come up with that older analysis. And for this particular project, we wanted to update it because as you well know, so much has changed over the last 4 or 5 years that we wanted to sort of refresh that particular analysis. And then finally, the third bucket is sort of a new thing that we did for this project, and that was looking at how this transition is happening and how it affects people on the ground. So what we did here is we actually conducted a proximity analysis and gathered information on the population and the demographics of people that are living within 3 miles of each of the coal units that we identified. So that, I'm not going to be talking in detail about the demographics. We actually looked at percent minority population and percent low-income population within those 3 mile within that 3 mile radius. I'm not going to talk in detail about that right now, but just know that we do have a downloadable spreadsheet online where you can pull down the information, that demographic information and the population numbers around each of the coal plants. And people in communities, we hope, will find that useful for some of their work. So I just want to walk you through a couple of key findings of the analysis. And the first one is partly stating the obvious, and that is that the transition away from coal has really fundamentally shifted our nation's electricity system. But the additional thing is that we see that trend continuing with a lot of economically vulnerable plants, coal plants in the southeast. So these next couple of plots are going to show you how the coal fleet has changed over that period of time and what might happen in the future. So in 2008, we identified 1,256 coal generating units that were actually operational in 2008, and they represented about 357 gigawatts of generating capacity. And here's how that map sort of shifts as you look into 2016. So by the end of 2016, we identified 452 units representing just over 59 gigawatts that had actually retired over that period of time, and the retired units here are colored in red. An additional 98 units, or about 13 gigawatts of capacity, that had converted to another fuel, and most of that, again, was natural gas. And that leaves about 284 gigawatts of coal capacity that was operating at the end of 2016. And I should say these dots here represent, each one of them represents a coal generating unit, and as you know, coal-fired power plants can be made up of multiple units, and these are sized by the capacity of the units in megawatts. And so finally, if you look forward into the future, this map shows you what might happen in terms of our assessment of where the coal fleet is and where it's headed. So the yellow points are showing you the units that we've identified as already having been slated for retirement, and the blue ones are ones that either will retire or might possibly convert to natural gas. So for that piece, we found a total of 51 gigawatts of coal capacity that will either retire or possibly convert, and that represents a pretty big chunk of the coal fleet, about 18% of the capacity that remained at the end of 2016. The other interesting piece here, the green dots here, which you see a lot of them, particularly in the southeast, and these are the ones that we identified as uneconomic, in this case relative to existing natural gas. And those are the results of our economic stress test that I'm going to tell you about in a second on the next slide. But basically what it's saying is that these units are currently more expensive to run than an equivalent existing natural gas plant. So let me tell you a little more about that. So this is the next key finding. We found that more than a third, about 38%, of operating coal capacity is either facing or may face retirement. And as I said, that's about 51 gigawatts that's announced for retirement or conversion, and another 57 gigawatts that we've identified as uneconomic relative to existing natural gas. And here's the result of our economic stress test. And I'd like to emphasize that this is really a spreadsheet analysis of the remaining coal fleet that was operational at the end of 2016. We haven't conducted a you know, a model of the electricity system that takes account of the, you know, dispatch curves and tries to figure out, you know, in real time what might be dispatched over other resources. What we're really doing here is calculating the operations and maintenance costs for each of these units, each of these coal units, and then comparing them to cleaner alternatives. And so in that way, we actually assume that the cleaner alternative, the natural gas combined cycle units, the NGCC units, are assumed to operate at the same capacity factor as the coal unit that we're comparing it to. And that's what I mean by an equivalent sort of NGCC unit. And so this is the comparison that we were showing you on the map earlier. So again, that's that 18% of coal capacity that's either announced for retirement or conversion, another 20% or so that we found to be uneconomic relative to natural gas. And as you can see, those units tend to be located mostly in the southeast. One other thing I want to say before I move to the next slide is that you know, when we did this previous analysis for Right for Retirement, we actually made some calculations about the cost of adding additional pollution control equipment to the units to the coal units that don't have that equipment currently installed. And one significant thing to note for this particular analysis is that we did not do that calculation. So we're saying that 20% of the coal fleet is uneconomic compared to existing natural gas, without consideration of, you know, which of those coal units might need additional pollution control equipment and what it might cost to install those. So we haven't even looked at that question at all in this analysis. So the next thing I want to say is that it's even a stronger statement than just 57 gigawatts, because many more coal units are actually on the verge of becoming uneconomic. And so we did some sensitivities that we looked at, you know, including a couple of different carbon prices, changes in natural gas prices, for example. And if you add a pretty conservative $10 a ton carbon dioxide price, you see that 57 gigawatts of uneconomic coal goes up to about 92 gigawatts. And that's what you're going to see here on the next slide, which is this one. And so you can see along the columns here, the different bars show you the 4 different resources that we compared to. So I've been talking mostly about existing natural gas. We also compared to new natural gas units, and we compared also to wind and solar. So, you know, what you can see here is that, and then the sensitivities are shown in different colors. So the reference case is in that dark red, the costs that we assumed, and you'll see that about 57 gigawatts there for existing natural gas. And you can see how much more coal is uneconomic as you layer on these different assumptions. So if you see the low natural gas prices, you get a little more coal that's uneconomic in the darker pink, and then the light pink color is showing you how much is uneconomic when you assume a $10 a ton carbon price, and I've also shown the $25 a ton here, where you see a significant contribution or significant number of coal, amount of coal capacity that's uneconomic relative to wind. And I want to say, in one assumption that we made here is that you know, we assume that the resource is built in the same general area as the coal unit that we're comparing it to. And we assume different, for natural gas, we have regional assumptions around fuel prices and for capital costs and so forth. And as Simon's going to tell you in a second, what that means is that since we've sort of assumed that the replacement generation gets built in the same area, that represents a bit of a conservative assumption about the potential for renewable energy to replace some of these units. And Sace and Simon did some really interesting work digging into that piece, and so I'd like to hand it to him now. And I just want to put on the screen here, this is the short URL for the report, ucsusa.org/coal transition, and you can pull down not only that downloadable spreadsheet that I mentioned, but also the technical appendix and the fact sheet. If you look in the technical appendix, you can see more about the figure I was just showing you. And we also did a really fun podcast around this report that I would definitely convey to you for listening. It was really fun to do, and we had a good time with it. So with that, let me hand it over to Simon and let him tell you a little more about some of the additional work that we did with these numbers.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. And Jeremy, I think you need to push it over for me to become the presenter here. Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Simon Mahan. I'm the Renewable Energy Manager for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and really glad to be here and working with UCS on this report talking about coal. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the renewable energy opportunities that we're seeing down here in the Southeast. We have a number of opportunities with regards to wind energy and also solar power, predominantly because the prices of those resources have considerably dropped just here recently. When it comes to wind power, we view wind as kind of three different opportunities. Taller turbines with longer blades has really enabled development directly within the South. Earlier this year, the Amazon Wind Project over in eastern North Carolina went live, highlighting that wind turbine technology has improved to a point to make it economically viable to be built within the Southeast. We can also use existing transmission lines. So we're already importing 3.5 gigawatts of wind power directly into the South using existing transmission lines. That's wind power flowing to our region, coming from places like Oklahoma and Kansas and Iowa. And then the third opportunity we see are these high voltage direct current transmission lines that are designed specifically to import some of the best wind energy resources directly into the South. So that's the Plains and Eastern Clean Line and also Pattern Energy Southern Cross projects. Both of those combined would equal about 6,000 megawatts of low-cost renewable energy resources that are available to our region. Already, we also have over 5 gigawatts or 5,000 megawatts of solar power facilities already online in the South. So this is a reality that we're dealing with today. We see a lot of opportunity in this space. And so let's go on and talk a little bit about the economics of what we're seeing and more specifically what the UCS report looks like with regards to renewables. With this slide, each year Lazard Associates publishes something called a levelized cost of energy analysis. And here they're showing that over the past 7 years, wind power prices and solar power prices have declined significantly. So wind power prices have dropped by about 66%, and solar power prices have dropped by 85% at the utility scale. So it's important to note that when Lazard does this analysis, they're actually looking at the unsubsidized value of wind power and solar power. So you can see the lowest cost wind resources, some of the best wind resources at about $32 per megawatt hour. That's 3.2 cents per kilowatt hour. That does not include the production tax credit that UCS evaluated. And we've even heard some lower prices coming out of the Midwest at 2 cents or below 2 cents when you incorporate the production tax credit. Similarly, the investment tax credit for solar is not included in these values, but generally what Lazard is showing here is that prices have declined significantly, making wind power and solar power economically competitive, and we anticipate those price declines to continue moving forward. In Lazard's bigger part of the analysis, where they're actually comparing different generation technologies, they actually are looking at new technologies or new power plants that can be constructed, and then breaks down what those levelized costs would be across technologies. And so that way it makes it a little bit easier for us to evaluate these competing technologies based on their price per megawatt hour or their price per kilowatt hour. And as you can see here, wind power prices are already exceptionally low, very competitive against new build gas, and certainly while no one's talking about new build coal, it does highlight that it is a good low cost energy resource. against many of these other technologies. And similarly, you've got solar PV at the utility scale that is also very cost competitive and interesting. Again, these Lazard figures are unsubsidized. They do not include that production tax credit and investment tax credit, which would make those resources even more competitive. So that's led us to believe, as Jeremy mentioned before, the analysis that UCS has done is quite phenomenal, but it is conservative in that it evaluates wind energy resources that are locally available, effectively in the backyard of these existing coal-fired power plants. We believe, based off of what's already happening in the market, you can import wind energy from other areas. You can use existing transmission. You can use the new HVDC transmission projects. And you could even potentially build wind farms in different parts of states that weren't necessarily evaluated in the UCS analysis. And so what we did was we provided kind of this basic point to look at, if you could get renewable energy, wind or solar power at $40 per megawatt hour, what would that end up looking like in regards to the ripe for retired analysis for some of these existing coal-fired power plants? So with the original UCS report, we saw that wind energy was competitive against 8.1 gigawatts worth of existing coal, and swapping that out for wind would save about $94 million per year. But if you use this $40 per megawatt hour baseline number, the amount of coal that is available that is uneconomic increases to 15.2 gigawatts, and that would result in a savings of about $230 million per year across the region. So I do want to note that as a general disclaimer, we know that wind energy and solar power resources aren't directly swappable for dispatched coal. But resource planning models, they're capable of modeling integration of variable generation resources like wind and solar power. And we've even seen places like Georgia and North Carolina where significant procurement plans of renewable energy are taking place right now. So while this quick analysis at the $40 per megawatt hour number isn't comprehensive, we're already seeing significant uptick in renewable procurement in the region, making it a lot easier for the Southeast to buy into low-cost renewable energy, and making it more likely that these coal-fired power plants appear to be uneconomic. And so with that, I will go ahead and swap over to Amelia as our next presenter.
All right, thank you very much, Simon. So I'm going to give an overview state by state of our southeastern states and the findings of the Dwindling Role for Coal report. And I've pulled Jeremy's map of the country up again just to underscore all those green dots in the southeastern region compared with the black dots in the rest of the country, showing that of all of these coal-fired power plants that are uncompetitive, the vast majority are in our region. So looking back since 2008, over 100 coal-fired generating units have retired or converted to burn natural gas, and an additional 21 are slated to retire by 2030. And I do want to just reiterate, as Jeremy said, the study looked on a unit-by-unit basis, and many plants have more than one unit. A typical plant might have 2 or 4. And they can be of different sizes. So we also give their electric generating capacity in gigawatts or megawatts for a sense of scale. So this green on the map represents 70 out of the 90 remaining operational coal-fired units in our states being uneconomic compared to existing natural gas. And another striking piece of this is that 20 units in the Southeast were uncompetitive compared with wind resources. So we're going to look a little bit more closely at that on a state-by-state basis. Our first state will be Georgia, and Georgia is first because it is actually number 3 in the nation for getting the most of its electricity generation from uneconomic coal-fired units at 29%. So this map shows the heavy dependence on coal in 2008. The size of the dot is related to the size of the power generating capacity at each site. And then in 2016, we see that many of these units have actually been retired or converted to natural gas, as shown in red and blue, respectively. And we're using open circles in this map so that it's easier to see when there are multiple units at a power plant, although sometimes they still overlap. Looking forward, every single one of those still operating units failed the economic stress test compared to existing natural gas, as shown in green. And in fact, several failed the economic stress test compared with wind. So knowing that Georgia Power already purchases some wind capacity through existing transmission lines and has potential to purchase even more through potentially under consideration transmission lines, the conversation is changing about the need to continue to rely on coal in Georgia. I also want to just emphasize that 29% of the generation coming from uneconomic units is the same as 29% of the generation coming from coal, since every coal-fired unit was uneconomic according to this study. And the 9 units that failed the economic stress test compared to wind, we did that same back-of-the-envelope calculation using a $40 per megawatt hour price, as Simon just discussed, and found that Georgia would save $34 million if those units were to be replaced with power from wind. Our next stop will be North Carolina. Again, in 2008, heavy dependence on coal. North Carolina is number 4 nationally, getting nearly a quarter of its generation from uneconomic coal-fired units. By 2016, many of those generators, especially the smaller ones, were slated for retirement. And of what was left, every single unit failed the economic stress test. I want to specifically mention the Rogers Energy Complex, also known as Cliffside, which was excluded from the initial analysis. Unit 6, the newest generator at Cliffside, is converting to natural gas, so is not considered in the study. Unit 5 is only partially converting, so we did do a separate analysis and found that it in fact was uneconomic compared with both existing natural gas and with wind. So another opportunity in North Carolina. Moving to South Carolina, number 5 nationally, still with more than a fifth of its generation coming from uneconomic coal units. In 2008, our heavy dependence on coal in South Carolina transitions in 2016 with many retirements and gas conversions. Of the remaining units that are still operating, every single one, once again, failed the economic stress test compared with natural gas. Looking now at Florida, which is number 7 nationally, we can see the heavy reliance on coal. And in fact, compared with some of our other states, in 2016, Florida remained heavily reliant on coal with far fewer retirements or conversions. However, moving forward, most of those units, except for one at the Northside plant in Jacksonville, failed the economic stress test. So we see a transition in the works for Florida. In particular, I want to point out the Christ plant operated by Gulf Power, which is in the panhandle on the left-hand side of your screen. Units at this plant failed the economic stress test compared to wind. Gulf Power already imports wind power and is part of the Southern Company system, so has an opportunity to move to a cleaner energy mix with resources that are realistically available in the fairly near future. And another noteworthy happening in Florida, since this analysis was done, one of those 16 uneconomic units was announced for retirement at the Seminole plant, which is the large green circle south of Jacksonville. That's slated for retirement in the next 5 years or so. Our last state today is Alabama, with 11% of its generation coming from uneconomic units. Again, in 2008, we can see that the picture was significantly more coal dependent than in 2016, with units operated by TVA in the northern part of the state at Colbert and Widows Creek retiring, along with some smaller units at Plant Gorgas and Plant Barry, and gas conversions at other plants. Moving forward, the only plant that survived the economic stress test was Plant Miller, the largest and newest plant operated by Alabama Power. All the other units in the state failed the economic stress test compared to gas. And again, in Alabama, we saw quite a number of units that were not competitive with wind. And if we add up the savings from replacing those units with wind at $40 per megawatt hour, Alabama saves $32 million. So again, an opportunity for a conversation in Alabama about moving away from a reliance on coal. At this point, we've talked to a fair extent about where transitions may need to be happening and where they have happened already, but we haven't talked very much about what that transition actually means. It's not as simple as flipping a switch. In fact, many of these coal-fired generators are also economic generators in a local community. So I'm going to turn the slides over to J.C. Kibbe at the Union of Concerned Scientists to talk about how that transition is happening or potentially happening in several places around the country. J.C.?
Thanks so much, Amelia. So we have already heard from Jeremy about what the national transition looks like away from coal and how economic forces are driving that, and from Amelia about what that looks like on the state level, particularly in the Southeast. But, you know, what we looked at in what we're calling these community snapshots is really how that impacted individual communities. And this certainly isn't, there's no cookie cutter answer to that. So we looked at 4 different communities all over the country, including one in the Southeast, and sort of the unique challenges that the transition away from coal presented in each of those places, and how they have dealt with that, and in some cases overcome it, and in some cases continue to struggle with it. So the first is here in Lansing, Michigan. So this was a coal plant that had shut down originally in 1992, and the site had sat more or less vacant for almost 2 decades. And this was a problem for the tax base. This was a problem for the quality of life in downtown and for the real estate market. It was really just sitting there draining property values. And so they were really looking to redevelop this, but there were a lot of challenges associated with that. The site needed to be remediated. They needed to find a tenant who was interested enough in it to invest the time and energy to remake this site, and was doing a business that could generate enough revenue to justify it. So these were some of the issues that were raised by Carl Dorshemer, who works at the Economic Development Authority in town, that you know, that were some of the problems they were facing with this site. But ultimately, they were able to find the Accident Fund is a subsidiary of a large insurance company based in Michigan, Blue Cross Blue Shield. They were interested in the site, and they had a public-private partnership where they really worked closely with the city, the Economic Development Authority, as well as the municipal utility, which is called the Board of Water and Light. And working together and identifying some tax incentives, they were able to redevelop this old coal plant that had been closed for 20 years into really an energy efficient LEED certified building, and they ended up either creating or preserving about 1,100 jobs on this site. And it's really become a crown jewel of downtown Lansing and was a keystone of the downtown revitalization that they've seen there in the last couple of decades. So it certainly was a challenging road to find all the right financial instruments, I think, to make this happen. But, you know, the message I got here was that with smart public-private partnerships and some political will, that it's really possible, you know, to do some interesting things with some of these coal sites, and Lansing is certainly an example of that. Moving on to Chicago, which is where I'm based. Love the city, and folks probably have heard, folks who have been working on coal issues for a while, about the Fisk and Crawford plants. This was a fairly high-profile coal campaign. These plants ultimately shuttered in 2011 after about a decade-long fight that had been led really by frontline communities, in particular by the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization in the case of the Crawford plant, and in the Fisk plant, another group in Pilsen. But we really focused on the Crawford plant, and I think that this was really a heralded victory at the time the plant was shuttered in 2011. It was frontline led, and then a lot of other folks came on towards the end, Sierra Club Beyond Coal and others, to really ultimately make the closing happen. But I think beyond the headlines and beyond the excitement about such a major victory for coal campaigners, is that this community has really continued to face environmental justice and economic challenges after the plant has closed. And that includes in the form of air pollution from a Unilever factory that was recently expanded in the neighborhood, and which brings hundreds of diesel-powered trucks a day through the neighborhood. This is located kitty corner, literally, from a school, and within a few hundred yards of another school. So it's a real challenge for public health, and they have fought to get this fleet electrified, or, you know, to have more of a say in the development of it, but that has been an ongoing struggle. They still haven't gotten much traction there, but they are doing some air monitoring and really starting to make the case for why this is a problem. But it's also really been impressive and inspiring to see how the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization has reacted proactively. A little bit of oxymoron there, but has been proactive about the closing of this plant. And one way that they did that was to get involved with the passage of pretty major energy reform legislation in Illinois last year called the Future Energy Jobs Act. And they were a strong environmental justice voice at the table as we were crafting that state legislation. And they pushed for measures in the bill that help environmental justice communities that I don't think would have been in there otherwise. Those include the state's first ever community solar program. It includes a carve-out in the state's renewable portfolio standard for low-income solar. There's a job training program in there for solar installations that are done through the state's renewable energy programs, which has carve-outs in it for both people who came out of the foster care system as well as formerly incarcerated people. And so they really created the renewable energy law to not just grow clean energy in the state, but really to provide economic opportunity in environmental justice communities and frontline communities. And that's really exciting. And the last thing I'll say is they've also been working to make sure that the land that the Crawford plant is on, as well as some of the surrounding land in this old industrial corridor, is redeveloped in an equitable way. So they've been campaigning around that in the mayor's office. So there's really a multi-pronged approach that they're taking, and it's still a challenge and a work in progress, but potentially a model for what it can look like for a community like this to, you know, to have vision for development beyond the closing of their coal plant. But also a lesson, I think, that, you know, that certainly it's not over when the doors shutter, as I'm sure many folks know. So I'm sure many folks here will be more familiar with this plant here. It's the Roxboro plant in Samora, North Carolina. And, you know, in this case, it wasn't so much that the plant is closed. Of course, it's not. It's still operating. And they're, based on the folks that I've talked to, seems to be it's a complicated issue about whether the plant should close or not. But what does not seem to be complicated is the really, the public health issues around this. There's been pretty serious coal ash contamination in the area, and that has included the water, and there's been some issues with enforcement around that in North Carolina government, again, as I'm sure many folks know here. But I think what this highlights in terms of our analysis is that, whether or not a given coal plant closes, and even if it does, there's going to be an issue, a legacy to deal with of coal ash and of other pollutants. And the challenges not only of organizing and the logistical challenges of cleaning something like that up, but also of governance and of building the political will to address what really is a very expensive problem, but as is so often the case, is affecting frontline communities, is affecting working people and people of color the most. And of course, we're seeing this story repeated all over the country. So another issue that will persist even as we start to see more and more coal plants shutter. And finally, the first three case studies here have really focused more on communities that were impacted on the generation side. But in this case, we've looked at a community which has been impacted by a move away from coal on the extraction side. So Huntington, West Virginia, of course, is a community that has historically had a substantial chunk of its economy dependent on coal extraction. And as the coal industry has declined, as well as become more mechanized and shifted more to large-scale strip mining operations in the West and away from the kind of shaft mining that has historically been prevalent in Appalachia, Huntington and other communities in West Virginia have struggled to fill that gap in their economic ecosystems. And I think what was really inspiring here was the work of the Coalfield Development Corporation, and Jeremy was point on this one. He's from West Virginia, and they are working to retrain former coal miners to a variety of industries. I think most interestingly, from my perspective, sustainable construction, the reclamation of land that mines were on, in particular mountaintop removal sites, and solar installation. So again, it's an opportunity that we see where we can really transition some of these communities directly into the sustainable energy economy, and I think that that's a really important link to draw there, and will be helpful as we have these conversations about the shift away from coal, to not just say that we're not going to do this, but to really lead with the new opportunities that the clean energy economy creates, and they're certainly doing a great job about that in West Virginia. So having looked at all these case studies and, again, gotten some context on the national picture, I just want to put a little bit of a ribbon on this by talking about some of the implications and the policy recommendations that we came away with after doing this analysis. And I think the community snapshots really drive these home. Number one, that stakeholder engagement is critical, that, both in terms of the direct transition away from coal, but also, the redevelopment that takes place in the wake of that can't be done in a vacuum, that can't be done from the top down. And as we see, in particular in West Virginia and in Chicago, the folks who live in these communities really know best what they need and what they want in terms of real estate development, in terms of economic development, and in some cases in terms of more democratic energy systems. And I think an issue that's been very salient these last few months, of course, is really the need for federal response. We've seen some legislation proposed, in terms of the Reclaim Act, and there's been some funding for economic transition in Appalachia, but that really needs to continue, and I think that'll allow us to expand on the sort of promising programs that we see in Huntington and in Chicago, and to make that job training more widely available and really to spur economic development. Finally, I think the elephant in the room, often when we talk about the transition away from gas on an issue that can be somewhat complicated, is natural gas. And in many cases, this is, of course, the economic force that's driving the coal retirements, but it's also critical that as we replace energy generation capacity, hopefully some of it with efficiency rather than more power, but we need to be cognizant about the kind of climate future we need, and that just shifting wholesale from coal to natural gas is not going to get us to that 1.5 or 2 degree threshold. And so to really make sure that we're looking hard at renewable energy, supporting it with state policy and with markets design, so that we can transition as quickly as possible to a clean energy economy. And I think that ties right into the last point, is just creating state policies for clean energy development, and not just renewable portfolio standards, but policies like the kind that we recently saw in Illinois that really center frontline communities, center economic justice, and create opportunities, economic opportunities for frontline communities and for coal communities. So I think that concludes my section. I will go ahead and pass it back.
Thank you, everyone. As a reminder, if you have a question, please click the question mark button along the top of your screen and make sure all panelists is showing up in the drop-down menu. Then type your question into the questions text box. So our first question is from Richard Howe. Many argue that favorable tax treatments to fossil fuels are not subsidies because they are the same tax breaks given to other industries. If that is true, then why don't we simplify the code and take out these industry-specific tax codes? Simon or Jeremy, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I can go ahead and try and give this a stab. So the wind industry and the solar industries both currently have something called the production tax credit for wind and investment tax credit for solar. Both of those incentives are actually phasing out right now. And when they do phase out, that effectively eliminates the largest federal incentive available to those industries. Meanwhile, there are different financial makeups for some of the fossil fuel industries that are not available to the renewable energy industries, such as master limited partnerships. That type of subsidy or program excludes renewables. And so right now, as things are, the subsidies going to fossil fuel and nuclear interests are slated to remain for quite some time, while wind and solar are designed to phase out. That being said, we're seeing prices for wind and solar drop so quickly that those are some of the first industries potentially that may not even need tax credits just because the technology is becoming so good. So, we can have more of a discussion on subsidization and tax credits at some later point, but the fundamental point remains that wind and solar power prices continue to plummet. We're seeing them improve, and that's ultimately what's driving a lot of the economic decisions at these utilities.
Thanks. Our next question comes from Sam Collier. Is there a trend in terms of the age and/or size of coal plants that makes them more or less uneconomic? Any other factors? Jeremy, can I pass this one to you?
Sure, I can take a stab at that. So you're right. I mean, there's certainly that we tend to see that the ones that are either are announced for retirement or are sort of uneconomic tend to be the ones that are older and sort of being used less often. So if you, we do have a table on this in our technical appendix in the back, and what we find for the announced retirements, the average age of those generators is about 49 years. And for we don't see much of a difference though in looking at the uneconomic compared to the economic units, as both tend to be about 41 years old. If you look at the capacity factor, which is a measure of how often the plants are run, so that's usually expressed as a percentage, and it means like the percentage of hours during the year that the plant is or the unit is generating power. Again, for the announced retirements, it's about 35%. And just to give you a sense, a typical coal plant that's operating at full, quote unquote, full capacity would run at about an 85% or higher capacity factor. So the ones that we found identified as already having been slated for retirement, their capacity factor in 2016 averaged about 35%. For the ones that we found to be uneconomic relative to existing natural gas, the average was 40%. And then for the remaining fleet of coal units that we found to be economic, that average was more like 58%. So the point is that the ones that are being run less often are the ones that are either planned to retire or we find to be uneconomic.
Great. Our next question comes from Alexander Eastdale, and this will be our last question. Are retraining programs ad hoc to each region or part of a larger strategy led by the federal government?
I can take a stab at that one if you like, Amelia, and others can weigh in. I think there have been federal programs. And I also think there's a bit of a problem with it being kind of piecemeal. So it turns out there are a lot of programs out there that are funded by federal agencies that either support worker retraining or they support community economic development. The problem is that they're spread among something like 8 or 10 different federal agencies. So there are a lot of programs within the Department of Labor around things like the Trade Adjustment Act, which was set up to handle retraining workers that were affected by the decline in the steel industry, for example. And then there are programs like another one is within the Department of Commerce, which has the Economic Development Administration, and that's where there's a lot of funding for economic development programs at the community level. Another one that's important to the Appalachian region is the Appalachian Regional Commission, which has done a tremendous service to the region over the last 50 years, and particularly in the last couple of years has ramped up funding for community programs that support economic planning and economic development projects in the region. And it's worth noting that the administration's proposed budget actually zeroes out a lot of these really critical programs that support development and retraining in the region. So, and then to your other point of the questioner's point, Alex, that there can be local and state programs as well. I'm not quite as familiar with the details of those. I think JC mentioned one of them in terms of the the Illinois Future Energy Jobs Act, which actually set up some incentives or set-asides for investing in particular places that are environmental justice communities or maybe particularly affected by the transition.
Thanks, Jeremy. We had one more question come in that I hope might have a quick answer and we can address it, and then any further questions we'll do our best to follow up with folks offline. From Susanna Randolph, other than a comparison between gas and clean energy, is there any data or studies that make the case that gas is uneconomic? Simon, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so when you start talking about gas, that moves us away from the topic at hand here with regards to the existing coal fleet. But I do want to mention gas is a little bit more complicated because there are multiple different types of gas power plant configurations. And so there's not a good, clear answer, and it certainly depends on what types of resources you're looking at. So such an analysis could be done, but just not in this one.
And probably, if this is Jeremy, I would just point back to what Simon was talking about earlier. Probably the Lazard analysis is one of the ones that, sort of I look to if I'm trying to understand, the relative costs of different generation technologies. And I don't remember offhand where the gas plants land in that. But again, that's sort of looking at the comparison on a levelized cost of energy metric, which isn't quite what we did with this analysis. But I would point to Lazard as a place to kind of get a sense of how the different generation resources compare.
Well, thanks again to our presenters and to everyone for joining us today and for your thoughtful questions. Today's presentation has been recorded and will be available on the webinar archive page of cleanenergy.org. And we will also send you a link to that recording along with a link to the study, the podcast, and the SAFE Southeastern blog on the report once that recording has been processed. If you enjoyed today's presentation, consider joining SAFE so that we can continue to work towards clean energy solutions for the Southeast. Visit cleanenergy.org for info on how to join and become involved. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.